Good evening, everybody. I'm Sina Rauschenbach, Professor of Religious Studies and Jewish Thought at the University of Potsdam and one of the organizers of this lecture series. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Hilda Nissimi to you. Hilda Nissimi is Professor of General History at Bar-Ilan University and a specialist in modern history, nation building, the British Empire, and the study of religion, gender, and migration. In the field of Jewish studies, Professor Nissimi has worked on Jewish identity construction and heritage cultures in Jewish museums, both in Israel and the diaspora, with recent publications on, and I quote, "The Danish Jewish Museums as Discourse on a Minorities Integration," published in the Journal of Jewish Studies in 2020, "The Zionist Rhetoric of the Israel Museum," published in Ionim Bitkumat Israel in 2017, and "The Holocaust in the Israel Museum," forthcoming with the Journal of Israeli History. Important for our lecture series today is Hilda Nissimi's research on crypto-faith communities in general and on the Mashhadis in Iran and the diaspora in particular. This research too has been published in an impressive numbers of articles and book chapters, but first and foremost in Hilda Nissimi's important monograph, "The Crypto-Jewish Mashhadis, the Shaping of Religious and Communal Identity in Their Journey from Iran to New York," published with Sussex Academic Press in 2007. Actually, Hilda Nissimi's work goes far beyond the Mashhadis because she compares different crypto-Jewish and crypto-faith communities in modern and early modern times, raises questions of gender, identity, and crypto-religiosity that all scholars in the field share, and connects her research to topics such as the Iberian conversos that we have heard about in Jonathan Schorsch's lecture a few weeks ago, and will continue to hear about in the course of this lecture series. I was so fortunate to meet Hilda Nissimi at Duke University in John Martin's and Malachi Hakohen's wonderful seminar on providential modernity, and I hope for long that we would now make it into a second meeting in Berlin and Potsdam. As we all know, this has been impossible, but I'm glad that Hilda Nissimi agreed to contribute a chapter on the Mashhadi Jews to our lecture series today, and I'm optimistic that we'll make it for a personal event in the future. Dear Hilda, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Zina. Thank you for this very kind introduction, and thank you even more for inviting me. I think this is a great opportunity. And thank you again for sending this light to a very small community, especially in comparison to all the other communities that I know that your program is going to deal with, the Yemenites and the Tunisian, let alone the Spanish diaspora. So this is a very, very small community. And so thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about them. And a thank you goes to my husband, through whom I met this community. He is one of the community. And just sheer amazement at the story that I didn't know of, that I knew nothing about before I met him. I mean, on our first date, he told me the story of the conversion. And the next day, there was no Google then. So the next day I ran to the library just to make sure that he wasn't pulling my leg and trying to impress me with no reason. And so thank you to Reuven for introducing me to his wonderful community. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. So let me share with you my PowerPoint, so you don't have to look at me all the time. And we are going to talk about the Mashhadis, as Zina said. The double H is because that's transliteration, but it's Mashhadis. And some people will pronounce it Meshadis, or because Mashhad might be pronounced as Meshad. It depends on where you're coming from. I'm writing it as the Mashhadis write it, or as the Mashhadis pronounce it. So it's the Mashhadis, and I will talk a little bit about them before they became crypto-Jews, just a few words, just to give us the context. Then about half the lecture is going to be about their time as crypto-Jews, because I think that's what makes them special, and that's what will determine the way they live after crypto-Judaism is lifted. And the second half of the lecture is going to be about them as a global community, as they become a global community, which is actually my current research about them, and for which is supported by an ISF grant as well. So shall we get started? So this is Iran. Iranian Jewry altogether is a small community. But it's one of the oldest Jewish communities, one of the oldest Jewish diasporas. The Mashhadis themselves used to have a tradition that is before the conversion. They used to have the tradition that they were there in Iran from the time of the first temple. In fact, that they were descendants of Bezalel ben Uri from the tribe of Judah. So it's a very old tradition. That's one of the characteristics. The other characteristic, lamentably, is that they suffered through most of their residence in the area, in the general area, pretty strict religious discrimination and persecution, which became much worse since Iran, under the Safavid dynasty, became a Shiite community. Quite often, those were expressed in forced conversions. The Mashhadis were not the only Jewish community in Iran to suffer such a fate. They were simply the ones that held out for such a long time. So as I said, the Iranian Jewish community is small, it is poor in the 19th century. And when most Jewish communities in the world double, and more so, the Jewish community of Iran becomes smaller, in fact, through the century. Jewish culture in Iran is characterized by Jewish religion and local culture, which determines the poetry they write, the literature they write, their gender relations, and so on. Mashhad. We'll need to know something about this city, because this is what determines what makes this city special, is what will determine their fate. And Mashhad is what was declared by Iran's one of its former presidents, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. It was declared into Iran's spiritual capital, but it did not need such a declaration, because that is what it was. That is what it was, at least since the Shiites took over. And it's the Shiites' second most important religious center. It is a place of pilgrimage. At the beginning of the 19th century, one of the travelers said that this is a city of 45,000 residents who receive 100,000 pilgrims through a year. Last time I looked it up, it was 25 million pilgrims these days. So it's a place of pilgrimage and of great religious excitement. It is also, which is also just as important for my Mashhadis, it is also, or at least it was, an important intermediary center of trade, as you see on the map right here in front of you, right on the Silk Road. But that means that it was an entrepot of a road leading from the south of Iran, going north as far north as Moscow and as far east as Vilnius, and going west and going east as far as Peshawar and Bombay. So it gave the Jews who came to Mashhad at the very beginning of the 18th century, in the 40s of the 18th century, giving them more economic opportunities than most Jews in Iran at the time. And this is how they were depicted by Arthur Connolly, a British intelligence agent. Their situation is respectable compared with that of their brethren in the cities of Tehran and Isfahan. Now, and you see how it's a matter of how you pronounce it and where you come from. And so he is writing the way he hears it at the time. So anyway, they were in a better situation than their brethren in Tehran and Isfahan. It was an affecting sight, this fragment of Israel in Oriental garb, adhering religiously to the ordinances of their forefathers amid the persecutions of the most bigoted of a bigoted race. Not a man, they said, had gone out from them. Lo yidach mimenu nidach, I think, is what he is alluding to here. And I was excited to read this because it sounded like I can hear them as they were speaking to him. This is before the forced conversion. And just to give a quick notion of what it means to be living, to be a Jew living in Iran before the forced conversion, just Iran, Iranian Jewry in general, Jews in Mashhad, maybe in particular, the sense of discrimination that they were facing at the time. One of the things that he doesn't mention here, besides being demanded to wear some special patch on their breast and having a special cap and having children throw at them things. Besides these things, Jews in Shia Islam are considered nijat. They're considered unclean, which is very different from what they are facing in a Sunnah environment. And that means that they are not allowed out in a day in a rainy day, because any water that touches them becomes unclean and makes everything else unclean as well. So this is a very different environment from what you are hearing in your other meetings of Jews meeting Muslims. That was, as I said, those were the good times. And one of the other things that is special, that is important about Mashhad in its location, is the fact that it is an important point of meeting of the great game, as it was called, of the competition between Britain, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire. Britain, as it was protecting India all over the place, I mean, as far as Mars, as Salisbury said once, and the Russians, who were pressing down on their way to conquer Central Asia, and they were meeting, so to speak, in northern Iran and in Afghanistan. And this is how the forced conversion came about, because it was after the war of 1837, 1838, when the Persian army that was supported by the Russians was defeated by the Afghani army that was supported by the British. And the Persian army was was camped around Mashhad. They were without pay, they were without food. And it was Muharram, it was March, and that was a month. That is a month that is supposed to be a month of contemplation. That is supposed to be a month of, at least for the Shiites, also of mourning. And on 21st of March, which was Nowruz, the new year of that year, a day of fasting was declared, and on the 27th of March was the attack on the Jews in Mashhad. So there is this thing about Jews being quite successful economically in the city. They were in contact through their commerce and through their economic enterprise with the British, which means not only the infidels, but also the enemy. And there is this background of defeat. The Mashhadis tell a different story. They tell something more of, in the sense of a blood libel. Some of them use actually that word. And others speak about this incident of a dog being thrown out just as the procession of the Ashura day is, which is the day of mourning for the Shiite imam, and they take offense. They see this incident as an insult to their religion, and the mob attacks the Jewish neighborhood in the south of the city of Mashhad. And here you have before you a small quotation from a rabbi from Afghanistan whose family originally was in Mashhad during the forced conversion, and he tells us like this: in the year 5599, a cunning libel was spread about our forefathers on the 13th of Nisan, that's the eve of Passover. On the 5th day of the Shabbat, they all gathered to annihilate the Jews and to steal their property until they all converted. And 31 souls were killed, and if not for our God, there would not have been any survivors. There were other reports from the time that speak about 36. Some even mention a higher number. It was a high percentage of a small community because the community was just a few hundred people strong at this time. It's not particularly small in the sense of Iran, but it is not a large community. In addition to the people who were murdered, also a large quantity of their merchandise was taken. The merchandise was returned afterwards at the behest of the Shah, but although there was an order to allow them to go back to Judaism, what the Shah said in Tehran did not go far enough to reach Mashhad. Mashhad, as I said, was a very important religious city, and the religious authorities of Mashhad were much more important to what went on in Mashhad than the Shah in Tehran. So this was the watershed. This is what turned the Mashhadis into Mashhadis, because some of the Mashhadis, a large portion of them, about half of them, left Mashhad to Afghanistan, to Herat. Today they're Afghanis. The Mashhadis still remember them as Mashhadis. They still have marriage connections. They still have the same family surnames. But Afghanis are Afghanis to Afghanis, but they're Mashhadis for the Mashhadis. And one of the main differences between those two communities is how they perceive the conversion and how important it is in the formation of their identity. So when you read memoirs of Afghani Jews, you will see how important it is to them to write about how hard life was in Herat, how difficult it was to live in Afghanistan, but they hardly mention the conversion. For the Mashhadis, it's like a password. We are the ex-converted Jews, and it turned into a formative memory. And this is one of the things that is similar to other converted, to other crypto faith communities. But another thing that is important and that turned them into who they were, into this special community, is the fact that they had to choose their identity. It had to become something of something conscious. They had to choose what they are going to preserve of their Jewish religion and what is going to be left behind. Of course, it wasn't entirely a matter of choice. Obviously, it had to be a matter of what they could or couldn't do. But it was, at least in part, a matter of choice. And I'll give you a few examples in a minute. But as I said, it was also a matter of writing history. So the Mashhadis, unlike other crypto-faith communities, aren't great writers. They were traders, not writers. But we have one very beautiful poem that was written in 1905 by Rabbi Shlomo Mashiach, who you have here in front of you. And he waves his own community's story within the larger story of the Jewish people, within the story of sacred history of the Jewish people, and makes those two into one. And that is, I think, also one of the important things that turned the Mashhadis into this special community. On the other hand, I must admit that we have very little written by Mashhadis from the time that they were in Mashhad. And one of the examples you have here in front of you, here is the list, chronological list, that was compiled by Rabbi Levi Nissim, which is my husband's grandfather. And he was one of the leaders of the community in the 20th century. And you will not see, those of you who can see well, and if you like, I can send you the photocopy of this, they will not find the forced conversion on this page. So maybe while they were in Mashhad, they were not writing about it, but they most certainly remembered it very well. And as I said, it was a matter of choice in what they can and what they did keep, Shabbat and the holidays, which is one of the hardest things for them, because people were expecting that, which meant that Pesach, for instance, Passover, sometimes wasn't celebrated in the correct date, especially not in the early years. It was sometimes moved ahead or moved back, which means it was an act of memory more than an act of doing the ritual, going through the ritual. Another thing was the matter of kashrut, which meant meat that was properly that was slaughtered in accordance with halacha. And that was another big problem, because how can you stop eating meat? And we know of instances where Jews were caught actually around this question of the slaughter. But that brings me to another characteristic, and you have the women here in front of you, because this is how they distributed the meat. One family made a slaughter, and the women would put it under their hijab and distribute it among the other families. And this brings me to the second character, as soon as I manage to get it by. Yes, to a second characteristic of this crypto-faith community, as well as other crypto-faith communities, and that's gender. Although we are in the patriarchal belt, and nobody would say otherwise, I mean, including Mashhadis, especially including Mashhadis, we do have memories and even pride of the fact that the women were taking household leadership in spiritual matters. They were those who were freer, in a sense, from the pressure of the outside culture. And we even have some memories of women taking over communal leadership in matters of in spiritual matters, building synagogues, calling people to come back to Judaism, trying to teach Judaism, mainly to women, but not only to women. And the lady in front of you is one of those examples. If you ask me about her when I have more time, I will be happy to tell you. And the third, even perhaps the main thing that turns Mashhadis into Mashhadis is family ties. And you will often see among young people, even today, when they are pressed hard to say, what does it mean to be a Mashhadi? And they will say it means to be a family, a community that is a virtual family. which turned the entire ethos of this community into a matter of a conversion of blood and belief. I mean, you could not turn your back to your faith without turning your back to your family, and that would not have been a very wise thing to do, because a Mashhadi is never alone. Mashhadis, wherever they go in groups, and it means that they're your safety net. It means that they're your friends, and it also means that they're your partners in business. It's very hard to turn your back to something like that. So they would have double marriage contracts as the ones that you have here in front of you. They would keep a very strict memory of who married who, mainly within the family, very often within the one family. I mean, this is the Nissimi tree here. And this means that Nissimis were marrying Nissimis, although they were sometimes marrying Namdars or a few Hakimis and Dilmanis. But that means the fact that I can tell you who they were marrying for 200 years means that they weren't marrying too many families. And that was right about other families as well. When we come closer to the 20th century, they were marrying other families as well. But even then, it is within the community. So there is endogamy, a very strong sense of one family. And as I said, they were going everywhere together. So they were living together in clusters, and they were going out into small trade communities. Here you have Peshawar and a small group of men who were in Peshawar together. And you see the small quotation down, Rabbi Levi served as rabbi of the community. That was about 50 men or thereabouts, not families, in Peshawar who were there for commercial reasons, and some were with their families. Most of them weren't. The families were usually left behind. Another reason why women could assume household leadership. The rabbi usually gave a sermon after Shabbat Mincha, and his sermons were captivating. So a small group of 50 men were having their very own rabbi and their very own synagogue, no matter where they were. And as you see from the small map here before you, such colonies, sometimes with the families, as in Marv, sometimes mostly without their families, as in Peshawar, were all over the area around Mashhad. So Mashhadis were immigrants, I would say, to start with. But about at the turn of the century, of the 19th century, Mashhadis were spreading out outside of Iran, even beyond what I was mentioning, Marv, which is in Turkmenistan, which is then in the Russian Empire. And you have here this map, which gives you the entire map of their immigrations. I will say a few words about their immigration to Israel, to London, to Milan, and to New York in the little time that I have. I think I have about 10 minutes left, Zina, right? Am I right? Okay. So the first immigration was outside of Iran and outside the Iranian plateau was to the land of Israel. How did that come about? And that was, in a way, an outcome of their forced conversion, because in the 1890s, it became possible for Iranians, I remind you, Shiites, to make the Hajj, which is a religious request, to Mecca. And the Jews, the crypto-Jews, as good Muslims and as pretty rich Muslims, had to do the same thing. So about 10% of Mashhadi male, would perform the Hajj from the 1890s on, and they would make a small detour. I mean, they are on the way already. Why not make a small detour? And many of them made a stop in Jerusalem. When they made this stop in Jerusalem, it wasn't their first contact with Jerusalem. They would send money to Jerusalem, they would receive letters from Jerusalem, and they knew that, for instance, the Bukharan Jews were starting to go to Jerusalem in the 1890s. They were building a new neighborhood in the 1890s, but hearing about something and seeing something is a different matter. And coming to Jerusalem, seeing these new neighborhoods, this ingathering, as they felt it was, the ingathering, the final ingathering of the Jewish people, the redemption of the Jewish people just around the corner, they decided to do the same thing. So we have the first immigrants. First, they were the pilgrims of Mecca and Zion, which is how they called themselves. And then they were building their synagogue. First thing, of course, you have to have a Mashhadi synagogue. They were building a synagogue. 1901 was their first synagogue built, but they were building also houses for other pilgrims or houses for the first immigrants. And the next waves were in the 1920s, 1930s. In the 1950s, more than half of the Mashhadi community was moved to the state of Israel. So they were living in Israel in clusters, but not in one cluster. The first cluster was Jerusalem. Then they had one in Tel Aviv. You have here the lamentably very dilapidated synagogue, first synagogue in Tel Aviv. They have others now. And there were a few others in Herzliya, in Afula, but not one cluster anymore. Quite unlike what they had in Mashhad and quite unlike what they had in Tehran, because Mashhadis, I don't remember if I managed to tell you that or not, but Mashhadis were transplanted after World War II from Mashhad to Tehran within a decade. Because after the Second World War, with the closed borders, there was no more a Silk Road. There were no more economic opportunities in Mashhad. So they moved to Tehran. And in Israel, that was not the case. They were small clusters all over the place. And especially from the 1980s, I think they're the most diffused Mashhadi community, I think, that we have. About the same time that Mashhadis came to Israel, same family actually, the Aharonovs, they came to Israel at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1910, they also sent one of their people to London to make it to open an office there and to move their business initiatives to London. Those were the first Mashhadis. And there again, 20s, 30s, new waves. And by the 60s, they were moving out from their initial residence in Stamford Hill and establishing themselves in the area of Hendon, Golders Green, and Finchley. So they made it, as you might say. Milan is much younger. Milan came mostly from people who left the state of Israel or who left the land of Israel and later the state of Israel to settle in Milan. A small community, now it's even smaller, almost not there anymore, because they repatriated to Israel and or to New York. So Milan is almost gone. Actually, London is also almost gone. Same way, though less to Israel, more to the United States, which brings us to the United States and to my final part. And they're the most interesting ones because that's where you have Mashhadi land. That's where, so we had the community in Mashhad that went to Tehran and is now in Great Neck, New York. Although they are only about 25% of the global community, that's where Mashhad is well and alive. Still very high percentage of endogamy, though growing less by the year, and still a very closely knit community. And the synagogue that you have here in front of you, I mean, the community was mostly transplanted to the United States after the Khomeini revolution in 1979. The first, but the first Mashhadis came to New York in, I think, the 1940s, some of them perhaps even earlier than that, but the proper community was there already in the 50s, very small community, and the large community that we know is from the, as I said, from after the Khomeini revolution. And as soon as they came, they built, of course, a synagogue. Although there were Persian synagogues in the neighborhood, they needed one of their own. And as they moved to Great Neck within a decade, they had another community, another synagogue built there as well. Actually, they have 5. At first, they were using the beautiful Teherani synagogue in that area, but that was not good enough. So just to conclude, I think it would be great to do that with the quotation that I have here in front of you. And since I cannot see it because it is blocked with Zoom, I will read it from my own paper. And I would like you to notice some main motifs, which I think can give us a good inclination of what the Mashhadi community is about still today. It's from the Israeli parade, and it's from someone who was participating in the Israeli parade. And I would say that this connection to Israel, although they are not necessarily moving to Israel tomorrow, is one very important ingredient in their current identity. So this is how this young lady tells about her experience in the Israel parade. With much anticipation, the moment finally came and our group joined the line. Of course, I was smiling from ear to ear all the way through. But there was something more, a tremendous sense of pride that filled me walking with my community that day. I saw the faces of the crowd light up as we went past them, saying, "Wow, where is your group from?" And everyone from 8 to 58, I lost it, from 8 to 58 years old, answering proudly, "This is the Mashhadi Jewish community of New York. We marched as Mashhadis," as our banner proudly proclaimed. "We are from Mashhad." But more importantly, we marched as Jews, openly, proudly, something that our ancestors and millions of Jews before us could never do. And what I would like you to note is that she says, this is Jessica Kashizadeh, she says, we walked as Mashhad, we marched as Mashhadis. Well, she was not from Mashhad, okay? She is something like 18 or 19 years old. She was born in the United States of America. And those of 58, well, they were not born in Mashhad either. They were born in Tehran. So if there was something about them that was not, is Mashhad, okay? So they were Mashhadis because they determined themselves as such. The second thing that you must have noticed is the word community. And about what, 50 words, the word community rather appears more than once. And the third word is pride. The fact that they were very proud. What are they so proud of? And although the forced conversion isn't openly mentioned, this feeling of openly being Jews, as in contrast of what was before, is a very deeply determining factor. Thank you very much.